try and work on producing a more formal and structured charter for the TOC that will cover things like tenuring, how people can be nominated for and be appointed to the TOC and things of that nature, as well as talking about composition and distribution of seats, and clarifying the role, right, making more formal maybe the role of the TOC. We've had some pretty. The TOC's goal has been to help make technical decisions and operate by consensus, right, and to help drive the project forward. And we've been pretty consistent about making sure that anyone who's going to come into the TOC has a long track record in the project, including being a working group lead. And I think you would expect to see those kinds of things carry forward. But we're going to work on a charter and try and make that a little bit more formal. In the meantime, until that's done, I don't think we're going to try and immediately fill Shriram's seat. We were historically operating with 6 people before, and that is, an effective way of helping a committee operate by consensus. But we'll try and get this done as quickly as possible, and all feedback will be welcome. The process will be done like the steering one. There will be a GitHub PR. People will be asked to provide feedback, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't have a fixed timeline for getting this done, but as soon as possible. Hopefully that answers most people's questions. All right, Neeraj, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Louis. So before we go down this discussion, I want to make sure we let most of the TOC folks speak, and I have an idea on how we can address this in one line, and then we get the broader attendees pitch in with their feedback. So the problem that we have been observing in the community is, even though we have gone from 1.0 with our first production grade Istio to 1.9, which will be the next one after 1.8, upgrades are pretty surprising, right? There are hidden failures.
Yeah.
We have been changing the way we install and upgrade Istio a few times, and then what Istio provides itself has changed underneath. So some of them are documentation problems, some of them are test issues. So I wanted this discussion to bleed into what we are planning to do for 1.9. But before we go there, I think Mitch did few interviews, or maybe one. I don't know how many you did, Mitch. So take it away next and talk about your findings, and then we'll circle back.
All right. Cool. So yeah, you may recall that we had a survey that we covered about a month ago in the TOC with regard to upgrade practices that showed that there's a lot of users running old versions of Istio. And so the UX working group was asked to circle back with a few users and get kind of qualitative feedback of why, because the survey really couldn't answer that for us. So next slide. We were able to interview.
Actually, sorry to interrupt. While I present, I can't take notes anymore. Could somebody else take notes during this section? Thank you.
I can do that.
Thank you.
So we presented to we didn't present to. We interviewed 3 users, Mindbody, Akamai, and AutoTrader. They were very helpful in sharing their experiences with the UX working group. All of the videos are, I believe, available now on the UX working group channel, and their notes are available in the Drive doc. But this presentation is going to try to synthesize some conclusions from these interviews. Also, keep in mind that these users are all large-scale users of Istio, long-time users of Istio, Mindbody being the most recent Istio adopter at 1.2. The others started sometime before 1.0. And the particular users we interviewed are platform owners. So they're not authoring applications or even paying much attention to individual application configuration on Istio. They're responsible for their entire platform, Kubernetes operations, Istio control plane upgrades, the CI/CD pipeline, all of that is their responsibility. So let's go ahead and look at the next slide. So I had hoped that I could bring out a particular common theme from each of these interviews of here's the technical problems that we're running into. But the truth is, it's just 1,000 small problems. When you upgrade Istio, there are a lot of tiny things that tend to go wrong. And for upgrades, I'm talking particularly about minor version upgrades. Patches, the feedback is that those are relatively stable. And so I don't think that I can synthesize any one common thing we could do technologically that would solve all of these issues. As a matter of fact, Carl pointed out in his interview that I'm interviewing some of the most complex users of Istio who have, hundreds to thousands of services running with all kinds of different configurations and constraints. And the truth is that Istio is not going to be able to test for all of those scenarios as a project. When you deal with the top 5% of complexity, some of those users are going to find bugs as they roll your software out that are just not going to be caught by test infrastructure.
So Mitch, one question I have is, so for patch releases, we're not seeing a big problem. That's good. I'm wondering if these changes are intentional. People are taking the opportunity to break things when they can. And so maybe what we really need to do is say even these sort of things should not be done when at all possible.
Yeah, I think that would cover some of these. Some of these also are Istio being used in ways that we did not anticipate. We've heard, I can't recall which working group covered this recently in the last 2 weeks. There was a feature change that involves some undocumented features of, I think, Envoy filters. And that caused caused problems for some users on upgrade, but we had never documented those features. We never expected users to leverage filters in that way.
Yeah, and I think we have warned on use of filter that you take upgrade risk if you use that API.
Yeah,
well,
that's right.
Well, and a bunch of these others that are in this list look to be more configuration changes, not necessarily an API per se, but more a configuration change. But ultimately, many consumers would probably look at that as a API level change.
Exactly.
I mean, a lot of these are port changes, right? I mean, physically, we changed a port.
Yeah. I think the contract we have is very loose. And what we do is, because that contract is loose, we change semantic behavior from version to version, which doesn't get documented or tested or conveyed to the users, and then it's a surprise for them. But I think, Mitch, you should carry on. And
there are a few more slides where I do actually draw some conclusions.
Okay.
The point of this slide is simply that we can't get into one technological root cause. If we approach this as software engineers looking at individual features, the number of problems are too diverse and too overwhelming to draw large-scale conclusions.
Well,
Next.
I think, Mitch, one thing I would note is that a lot of the ones there are because of infrastructural changes, right, in a base layer, right? That there's a kind of fundamental layer of Istio that's changing between releases. And until that layer stops changing, right, or we get way, way better at testing, we're going to continue to have the same problem.
I think, Louis, that I have seen some cases where the change wasn't necessary, but the person I talked to felt that it was the right time to make that sort of change. So, for instance, making our port numbering more consistent, where we really didn't have to do that, but that was considered, a cleanup, and between minor releases is when you can make breaking changes. I think we could push back on this more.
Yeah, so I think there are 3 themes that we have identified so far, right? So I still think we should let Mitch do some conclusion work for us, and then see if our conclusions are in sync. So carry on.
The next 3 slides really deal with kind of telling the story of what these users are doing. In each case, the users use a pipeline for deploying changes to their service mesh. And that's changes both in terms of upgrading the Istio control plane itself, as well as just tweaking a virtual service. Those changes go through, and they called them various things, but basically a development, staging, and production pipeline where they're trying to identify issues as early as possible. This is very much like software development lifecycle. The identification of a bug later in the process is exponentially more expensive than identifying bugs in development. However, they're not able to catch a lot of issues in development because the issues that they're finding in staging and production are not regressions. These are not things that have gone wrong before in previous versions, and so they'll write a test for development to catch them the next time. Those never trigger again. The good news is we're not breaking the same thing twice. We're finding new and interesting ways to break Istio. So that does make development of minimal value. It means that they don't spend too much time in their development environments testing Istio. Staging attempts to be a complete reproduction of production, and they do identify a lot of issues here. But then if they're going to need to change Istio as a result, now they've got to go back through the development process again. And then likewise, there are a good number of issues that will make their way into production because there is no environment like production, no matter how hard we try. And again, when we identify an issue in production, we start this pipeline over again. We make a change, we start it through development, go back through staging. The end result is that validating a new upgrade of the Istio control plane takes about 2 months on average for these users that we've talked to. Next slide. So if we consider that 2-month validation process, and we couple that with the fact that several of our users mentioned that they don't like adopting the .0 patch release, they'll wait for 1.8.2 or later before they'll begin evaluating an Istio upgrade. And couple that with our quarterly release cadence, that means that 8 months out of the year, our users are upgrading Istio. And this is just in order to be able to stay on a supported version. Because we don't support upgrades, and I've used the 1.1 through 1.4 timeframe because it makes it easy to see on this calendar. Because we don't support, say, 1.1 to 1.3, there's no way to take a break from upgrades. If you have a particular upgrade that was particularly difficult and took a lot more time, or perhaps burned some trust and you wanted to slow down your cadence with Istio, you will find yourself hopelessly behind in terms of Istio upgrades.
Unless you adopt a vendor distribution.
That's accurate. Yes, that's true. All right, and we can go to the next slide. The other half that we're hearing from, and this almost sounds like contradictory advice, we've got these quarterly releases and people are constantly having to evaluate upgrades. At the same time, releasing quarterly is actually a huge release. We're calling these minor updates, but the perception from our user is that some of them could have been a major version increment. There are about 1,000 commits per average in a quarterly release of Istio. By the time a user gets to deploying them, some of those commits are 4 months old. So if there's a bug found in them, there's a huge context switch for the developer who needs to go back and figure out what the problem was. I think there's also a little bit of a lack of intrinsic benefit or motivation for developers to go to their code that they were working on 4 months ago and patch particular issues. So there's a very long feedback cycle. The bugs get to be very expensive over time.
Yeah. Just another thing here, Mitch. If you look at the 1.6 cycle, we have gone up to 1.6.12 right now. It's soon to be 1.6.13. That's an insanely high number of patch releases for fixing bugs. So that tells you that the stability of 1.6 was nowhere close to what we thought we were shipping, right?
Also, well, there are also security releases too that we react to.
I agree, but still there's a fair number of bug fixes releases.
Also to clarify on that, I think it was with 1.6 we started doing a 3-week cadence. So even if there's not huge bugs, we're still doing a release approximately every 3 weeks to pick up whatever's there.
Yeah, still the math doesn't count up to 12.
Yeah.
So, and actually the patch releases bring up a good point regarding that calendar. If you're in the validation process, say you're in staging, getting ready to move to production, and a CVE is announced and a new patch release of that version, you start over. That's not necessarily a bug in Istio, but it impacts the workflows of our users and the quality of life of the platform owners at these companies. And that is a common scenario.
Do they treat a patch release like a minor release and qualify it using the same schedule?
They do. Their experience with patch releases is that there are far fewer issues identified, but often they're taking a patch and a minor. So they'll be running 1.5 in prod. They're evaluating, I don't know what's in it, but 1.6.12, and then let's say 1.6.13 is a security release. Now they've got to start their process over to evaluate the 1.5 to 1.6.13 migration.
So One thing I'd like to add, there's an interesting side chat going on in this about some changes that we made as part of our postmortem process for security releases, changing how we create these flush releases where we're trying to do a mix of give users the ability to take minimal patch releases while reducing our own workload. I suspect that has actually increased the frequency of the releases for the 1.6 branch. And it's not just like we all of a sudden have a flurry of destabilizing bugs. We've actually done something differently on the release side.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point, Josh. And also that the fact that we are no longer breaking users when they use patch upgrades, that's a big thing. Previously, that was not happening. So we should recognize that even though we have 12 patch releases, it's actually stable. So that's a good thing. We just need to fix the other pieces.
Yeah. I also see Andra had a question in the chat. What is namespace cutover from the 1,000 paper cuts slide? Namespace cutover is the relabeling of a namespace and restarting of the deployments in it. One of our users in particular felt that was too granular, that they wanted to be able to have a stable state for deployments where within one namespace where on different versions of the control plane. And
So
Francois has his hand raised.
one other thing I think we need to be explicit about is the use of blue-green deployments, right? It is supported. Some customers do use it, but we don't provide any explicit guidance on it. And in fact, that is exactly the reason. The reason they use it is to skip multiple versions, right? 1.1 to 1.5. Like that's when you do blue-green if you don't want to go through the whole process.
But let's also be mindful of people raising their hands to speak.
Yeah. Francois, go ahead. And I do want to come to solutions, but just not yet.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Mitch if these users were expressing explicitly that they were worried about the security release and they were changing their schedule because of the security release.
We got two different voices there. Two of our users said that when a CVE is announced, they will evaluate whether it impacts their particular utilization of Istio and then decide. The one other user said that every CVE, they immediately, if they're evaluating 1.6 and a 1.6 CVE is announced, they will go to the latest patch right away.
Okay, I have a quick follow-up, and that's a question generally for the TOC. Should we consider extending the early disclosure mailing list to very large users of Istio because of that? Which means we will provide to these large users something that they can evaluate, possibly an early patch they can build or something like that. Is this something that makes sense?
That's a good question, Francois. Whoever is taking notes, let's write it down. We don't have to answer it today. We'll come back. Right? That's one of the pieces that we can cover as part of remedial steps.
Well, and Francois, the talk that we had a month ago actually had some conclusions regarding security releases, and that was that visibility is too low on CVEs and patch releases. We had a good number of users, and I don't remember off the top of my head the number, but you can look back to the slide deck on, I think it was September 25th. A good number of users thought that they were on a version of Istio that did not have CVEs, when in fact they were not. So one takeaway that we can have from that is that communication can be improved, visibility could be improved there. Are we ready to move on to recommendations?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
All right. So these are kind of my summary recommendations that I take from this data. And I've divided them between strategic and tactical because there are changes that we can make immediately, and there are changes that are going to take longer to roll out. Strategically, I think a good number of our users expect to be able to run a version of Istio, a minor version of Istio, for a longer period of time than we're allowing. I think a year is probably the sweet spot.
I think we need to balance that with the cost for us to maintain that.
Absolutely. My goal here is to represent user expectations, not to represent the burden that this would be on the development community. I recognize that this is only half of the story. But I think that's a user expectation. I also think that they're seeing that expectation being met by other service mesh products that are available. And so we should consider that as a competitive advantage or disadvantage. Additionally, because of the number of commits that are involved in one release, there are a lot of users who would like to see more frequent, smaller releases. Combining these two together, I think would look something like a long-term stability and edge release channel. Although there are a number of different ways to do this. We talked about this recently in the test and release working group. There are a dozen strategies we could adopt along those lines and lots of terminology in that area. I don't want to get into the details there, but I think that there are a good number of users who would like to see these two sort of levers change across the project. On the tactical side, all three users said that they would very much like to use Helm for upgrading Istio, that the operator represented too much uncertainty for them and actually was the source of some of their upgrade pain. So that's an immediate tactical change that we've already begun making in 1.8 and that we can continue through 1.9. And then as we approach the 1.9 roadmap, which I believe is in 2 weeks now, or maybe 3, I would just ask that we prioritize stabilization over features. We're not hearing from users that they have these features that they absolutely must see from Istio or they will leave. What we are hearing from users is that we are breaking them on upgrade very frequently, and that is motivating them to very seriously consider other service mesh offerings.
Yeah, just to add here to Mitch's point, for me, for the longevity and effectiveness of our community, this is the major hurdle right now. Not just from the open source community users, even for our customers who are using our vendor distribution, because we have to choose between how often do we keep up with the community versus how much stability we provide to our existing customers. Everything is in a bind, right? At some point in our release cycle, we have to move over to the new stuff, and then we break our customers, or we say, no, we are going to support 1.4 for 5 years. Right?
So for a long time, we've been talking about better supporting Canary upgrades. So people can try a new version, but incrementally without these kind of Hail Mary passes where things break their down. I wonder if we should invest in that.
Go ahead, Mitch.
That has value, and I don't want to detract from it. I'm a huge fan of the Canary upgrade process. I think it's coming to Ingress gateways, hopefully in 1.8, as I recall, which I think is just a great development. However, for these larger users, they are already pursuing their upgrades in a very safe way. The problem is not that the upgrade is breaking production or that they're seeing production traffic outages. They already have so many safeties and pipeline checks involved in deploying Istio that that's not happening. The problem is they know they've got to upgrade production within 3 months, and ironing out all of the kinks through their pipeline within that 3-month time frame is very painful.
Yeah. So, Costin, hang on a minute. So, we have been the underlying themes here that we are seeing. I think Louis alluded to initially, which was we change the underlying infrastructure too often. Whether it's the fundamental charts organization, the install mechanism, or how you get telemetry overall. So we need to stabilize that core. Then what Josh said, why are we making changes knowingly it will break users, right? And then why are we not catching them? As in, what's the gap in our testing where these things actually make it to our code base and then users find out rather than our community members, right? Can we focus on these 3 things for 1.9 tactically while the TOC and the test and release group figure out the long-term support system? Right? I just want to make sure for 1.9 we understand that this project is in real danger. We are going to lose users. It's not gonna go well in terms of marketing. It's not gonna go well in terms of the ecosystem.
No, Costin, actually, you had your hand up.
Just wanted to say that maybe we should not even have a 1.9, but we should start, adopting this recommendation of having 1 year support and ship smaller releases, and take 1.8 and treat it as a LTS that will support for 1 year, and keep doing small incremental patches that we can guarantee and we can test that don't break releases. I mean, kind of freeze features and have a different branch where we can do any breaking changes for next year. I think that's super valuable for anyone who has central Istio or like systems where the operator will do this work without the user being involved. And it's probably about time to do it. It's because central Istio is the main driving factor for this. Since
Well, again, so I don't think, so there's a fundamental problem here about lack of tests. That's not going to get fixed if you move to a different development workflow here, right? People who write a lot of code need to write tests. And how do we make sure that happens in the community?
I think, Niraj, I think that both of those questions need an answer. We need to address the lack of an emphasis in test and stability in our development processes, and we also need to address customer expectations for longevity of a release.
So,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
please. Amanda, I'm so sorry, I'm speaking over your hand. I just want to set this up so that we can have the discussion after this meeting. It sounds like we should have more people talking about this concretely. What are the next steps? And it can't just be the test and release working group. It needs to be more of the people that also making the changes that may not attend that group.
Yeah, the test and release working group, as far as prioritizing stabilization, their role is to provide a framework. It's not to actually implement tests or ensure a high degree of coverage. That's on the various working groups that are contributing those features. There is a bit of a question, Niraj, that you raised about who decides how long our support policy is.
Sorry, actually, I want to get the transition to some sort of follow-up working group settled. So do we do that through the test and release working group, and we just make sure that more people attend that? How should we do it?
I missed your question, Josh. Are you saying?
I want to have, since we're not going to be able to come up with a concrete list of everything we have to do to solve this problem in this meeting, I want to be able to set up, some discussion that lasts after this meeting where we can come to some sort of recommendation. Should we do that through the test and release working group and just make sure more people attend that?
I think the higher level direction should be set by TOC, because we have been talking about this for the last 6 months. And it's not that test and release working group have not done a good job of figuring it out. It's just that it gets lost in the noise among working group discussions right now.
Yeah, so I think Niraj is right that a charter needs to be set. I think there's a question I have is whether the existing working group structure is meeting the need here. So like a probing question on that front would be, what is the responsible body for this problem? Right, that we aren't able to get through customers through upgrades in a timely and safe fashion. Right, is that environments? Is that test and release? Is that PHP? And do we need to do something about the structure here to make lines of responsibility clearer?
Feels like a TOC thing to me, Louis, at the higher level. Then we can find a delegate if you want.
It's not going to happen within our 1 hour every Friday meetings.
Absolutely.
So we would have to have some sort of special track for it.
Well, more directly, I think, could there be a distinct, could we very explicitly make this a responsibility of a working group, and I'm not saying which one, right, where there are people who work on this on a daily basis and view it as their primary function to solve this problem, right? TOC's job is generally to help set agendas and resolve, but we're not execution body, right? We're not the ones on a day-to-day basis writing code for any one of these things or writing tests, right? That's what working groups do. They do work.
I agree.
The valuable thing that TOC owns here is the roadmap for 1.9.
Sure.
That's where I would be looking for input from the TOC to say, hey, for 1.9, we're not looking for new features, and maybe even there's a pushback on new features. We're looking for stability.
I agree, Mitch. So there are directional guidance and then ownership for this, so that going forward in 1.10, we just don't break it again, right? Those are two things that TOC should decide. And I agree with Josh, it cannot happen in this hour.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think
should we look into actually form a special group for
yes.
this? Because
So
I agree with Josh, we need to take this offline and we need a dedicated group. Sounds like we don't have a responsibility
yeah.
group assigned.
So I propose I'll do the coordination. I'll set up a special group with the TOC, and we will invite people as we go.
Okay.
Right, so
Okay.
I have an
All right.
alternative proposal,
Okay.
right, which is that we recharter environments as install and upgrade.
That's interesting.
I think it warrants some discussion. We can do
Oh,
that.
sure,
sometime.
right. And like I'm just pointing out its proposal, but right, if you look at the two facets that are discussed in environments, right, it's how do we install on given platform X or make Istio work on platform X, and install and upgrade.
When you say recharter, it means make sure that you have consistent install and upgrade experience, release over release, rather than expanding the underlying platforms. Because right now, expanding the platforms is the key motivator for that group.
Right.
Okay.
So like where the other part goes, like we can decide, right? But you could view it as taking environments and splitting it in two, or creating another working group or something of that nature, but we very explicitly have an install and upgrade working group. And then we figure out everything else around it. If it's the number one thing that we have the most problem, and we don't have one working group that's chartered with that problem, then maybe that's what we should do.
Louis, for now, I'll set up the meeting with the TOC, and in our first meeting, we can decide to end that track and give it to a working group.
I agree.
Okay.
One thing before we move off this topic, though, since we are starting to plan out 1.9, and I know working group leads and the working group members are talking among themselves, we should come back with a direction for 1.9 soon, so that the churn over there is less, right? So, Josh, early next week, if you can meet, so that we can come back and say for 1.9, that's what we want. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and I think it's also a reasonable time to also look at the 1.9 schedule. Do we still want to do quarterly, given the feedback we just heard, right? Is quarterly the right thing for the project?
I think that's a great question. And what I would love to hear today, or maybe from this work group, is just who makes that decision? I know test and release has discussed it. Are they able to decide independently, or is that a TOC or even a steering decision?
Yeah,
I think it's a combination. I think, Mitch, still it has to be.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think let's meet and come back. Like Josh is saying, we'll do it early next week. We will make sure, we give some concrete directions instead of vague ideas anymore. And then we'll figure out the next steps from there.
Sounds good. Ready for a context switch? Mandar had his hand up a long time ago, and I talked over him. Mandar.
Oh, it was about the old topic, so we can table that. We can take it up when we resume.
So one thing I would ask, maybe coming back to the original, this topic was that there do seem to be some technical themes in the feedback that you got, Mitch. We need to do an analysis of that and to take a look at the roadmaps of given areas and assess how much feature churn or infrastructural churn those areas are committing to or have debt for. And what their roadmap looks like for the next year. Is their roadmap stabilizing or is it not? So, Custom, like if you look back, or John, actually specifically your network working group lead, a lot of those items were networking oriented. Right, there were a lot of things about TLS, about port switches, right, about possibly data plane compatibility issues between, upgrades and or other versions. How do you feel the technical roadmap for networking or the feature roadmap for networking is looking with respect to churn in those kinds of areas? Right? Do we expect to see natural stabilization, or do we still have a high rate of impending churn that's going to keep perpetuating this perception?
Yeah, I think the big common factor with most of the bugs was people doing the Istio D and some related changes with bespoke setups. And so we obviously tested some of these cases, but then when Carl comes and has these obscure setups, which we haven't tested, then they run into edge cases. And so now that we're not doing these architectural changes, like the changes that we're doing in networks are fairly stable. The one concern of a similar path is the BTS stuff.
Right. That is the big one.
Yes, that is, I think, the I don't want to say the only one, but the only one that I'm thinking of right now, at least. And we've been making a focus.
What was that change? Can you say
Yeah,
that?
the better transport security.
But
okay.
even the better transport security is not going to break anything if it's done properly. So I think the problem is expectations that every 3 months we can break stuff and we can make changes.
But Costin, that's
Not-
true for all features we have released, right? If you do it properly, it will never break. But if you don't do it properly.
I know, but the problem is the expectations that every 3 months we can break stuff. So if we move to an expectations that you move everything off by default, like we already said, it's off by default. It's guarded. It goes over 6 months. The process. You get feedback. You get and you don't turn it on by default ever.
I think we're not trying to come up with solutions here. So I'll wait for the meeting next week, and then funnel down some of the suggestions. But John, carry on.
I think Niraj, what I would like to see is maybe like we do a survey of the different areas and their rates of technical churn, and use that to focus investment in the project. Right. If we're seeing 80% of the issues are in control plane upgrades related to data plane interactions or data plane upgrades, right, versus say, security, right, or things that are being driven out of certain working groups, then we should look to also, like, part of this will be about assessing where to invest, right? Time, resources to produce testing, to improve quality, right, things of that nature.
So one thing I do want to add is that I think it does need to look at least one release back, because we seem to be talking about what to do with 1.9 and 1.10. If, like, for example, AutoTrader just moved from 1.5 to 1.6, so there are latent problems in 1.6 to 1.7, which we do need to think about, kind of with this lens.
Yes, I agree on that. I think we were just keeping 1.9 as an example of how we can relieve some of these problems immediately. But yeah, we can't forget what we have already done before. Totally.
Right. I mean, that will become even more of an issue if we start adopting LTSs, right?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is all what I have to discuss. This is a good discussion. Josh, you wanted to go in a different direction. You had another topic, I think. Did I hear that right?
No, sorry. I was just switching to coordination mode. Should we continue with this one, or is it time for the next item in the agenda? Let me switch back.
I don't think there was anything else on the agenda.
Okay, well, we can end early.
We're looking at this.
Yeah.
So do we need to get more strict about backwards incompatibility as part of this? Like it still bothers me that we actually have upgrade notes that say, like, hey, sorry, we broke your existing thing, and you have to change something.
Oh,
I think there's value there from a user perspective, but I do think we should keep in mind we cannot solve all of this problem with that. Some of these, like Carl's issues, are so, as John said, bespoke that I don't expect that we would actually catch them with strict backwards compatible checks.
Yeah.
No, I don't mean as the only solution. I mean, like, should we as a project?
Yes, it should be part of the solution.
Move culturally towards expecting things to continue to work.
Yep.
And like, if there's a beta API, an instance of that, a CR, right, that was from a beta API, should continue to work for, like a year or two, and a stable one should work basically forever.
Yeah, totally. And also, yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, we hear a lot from Carl, which is great. He has been a vocal supporter, and also when things break, surface the problems. And even though we look at his use cases, some of the simpler use cases are currently very broken. Just install and upgrade. And I deal with them on a daily basis with our customers who come from upstream Istio. So I don't think we can just say this is a problem of bespoke configuration. I think this is a general problem that people can't install and upgrade Istio easily.
Yeah. And I agree with that. I think back to what Savan was asking, I think we should think about what can we do for 1.8, right? 1.8 hasn't gone out of the door yet. So for me, if I'm a user right now, it's so hard for me to figure out what might be changed between 1.7 to 1.8 unless I do a diff on our installation API. I mean, that's the biggest thing, is there anything we could improve our user? Because I think I was in one of the call when Mitch asked one of the user present, and the user said, interestingly, I love Helm because values.yaml, I know where to find out the configuration knobs, but with operator, I don't know where to find my configuration knobs. And I remember when we used to have Helm as our installer, we actually have a single page where we publish to user, like between 1.2 to 1.3. These are the changes that's been deprecated. These are added. These are the default changes. So we have all that info for the Helm user back when we were doing that properly. Now that data is just not visible unless you go to source code to compare. And oftentimes there wasn't enough tooling to help people to detect. And you guys all know we sometimes forgot to put things in the release notes, especially upgrade notice too. And we've been kind of filling in upgrade notice as release went out when the user reporting problems. So I think it would be good for us to think through what can we do for the next few weeks for 1.8.
I think the consensus environment is that values.yaml, global.yaml, and all the other stuff is deprecated, and mesh config is the only thing that we support for upgrade and document, because we are going to operate Istio, and some people operate Istio without using Helm or operator, and central Istio may use whatever it's using, so we cannot support as a user, as a stable API values.yaml.
Austin, where is this documented on our website?
Where is it documented that values.yaml is supported? Or
yes, I'm asking that question.
I don't know actually, but Environment Working Group has been operating under this direction so far.
So Costin, I mean, part of this is we need to make sure that it's not just in the heads of the developers who wrote the code. We need to make sure that for a final solution, for an end-to-end solution, it's actually polished in front of the user and somebody on the outside can consume it.
Yeah, that's a good point. We should probably have some official, indications that for upgrade we support only the beta APIs plus mesh config. Values.yaml was never an API that was declared as supported.
Well, I mean, while I agree with you, Costin, we didn't declare support there. References to values.yaml are scattered all across our docs. It would be hard to say that like 90% of our install and upgrade docs reference unsupported features. That doesn't seem tenable.
That's true, but
it does not mean that there's an outstanding action item for owners of this decision to go and make sure that all the documentation is updated, as Josh said, to represent what Austin stated as the principle, right? And who?
Yeah, 4.1.8. I mean, if we have come to this consensus, yes.
Especially since in 1.8 we are launching central IstioD, and in central IstioD users do not have any control over the installation. It's operator that is creating the IstioD deployment in the central cluster.
And remember, we are bringing back Helm support. I've merged in the documentation a few days ago. I'm writing integration tests right now.
That's true.
Okay.
Right. So obviously there's a big gap there, right? Not necessarily in terms of what we're actually trying to achieve, but in terms of what we're actually communicating.
Who are the current working group leads for environment? And if they are on this call?
I'm
Austin's
one.
one. Steve is the other.
I'm Martin.
Is this something we can parallelize where at least for 1.8 users know what to use for installs and upgrade?
I think mesh config, I mean, the way mesh config is implemented as a part of values.yaml, so with Helm or with operator, with everything, mesh config is embedded in values.yaml. So all we need to do is document that mesh config is where you should put your configuration and then update docs.
That's what I'm asking, Costa.
Okay. No, there's some other things that are not yet put in mesh config. I thought that's what you were asking, and we still need to clean them up.
Okay, so there's some errata that needs to be covered.
Yep.
Okay, we need somebody to take on, or somebody in that working group to own getting that communicated.
Yes, we'll do that.
And this will be a blocker for 1.8, in my opinion.
Austin, I know that you've been really busy with a lot of other things in this release cycle, and your time has been pulled in a lot of different directions. Is there a different working group lead that would have more availability?
I would say all working groups should, go over their own docs and their own features and make sure they do not refer to values.yaml or depend on install options. We can, kind of look at a big picture and review it, but security has all kind of documentation, networking has similar documentations. I don't think one person can do all.
Well, so one person can obviously lead coordinating, but one person can obviously do all the work.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're looking for that leader right now, I think.
We'll take it over in environments and figure out how to do it.
So I guess the other, if there are people who are willing to volunteer, obviously people volunteering is always welcome. Josh said that he was going to set up a meeting for the TUC members. We'll obviously talk about this there too. But I think absent anything right now, that by default, that responsibility falls on the environments working group.
John, you were saying something. I think we interrupted you.
No, I was just responding to you saying that we would block the 1.8 release on this, which I'm not sure it makes sense because we haven't got worse than 1.7.
Right.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that. What we don't have in 1.7?
The values hasn't got worse than 1.7, so I'm not sure why we would block the 1.8 release on anything in this area.
It is a lot of late. It's arriving pretty late, so it would be nice to just queue this up for 1.9.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, but I guess I heard Neeraj was just asking for clear communication, which we definitely should do for 1.8 before the release go out, right? So that we can level set with our user.
Exactly. And users can use the new version or new way of starting from 1.8 so that 1.8 to 1.9 is smooth for them. Right?
If it's just a documentation thing, that makes sense. If it's a more substantive code change, maybe not. Okay, go ahead, Kasi.
Yeah, no, I agree, Neeraj, that documentation and expectations, setting expectations that mesh config and values are and that will also allow us to keep 1.8 alive and upgrade it for longer because again and since Central Istio is launching 1.8, that's probably the right moment to do it.
Sorry, this may be too much in the weeds, but I'm very confused how we're both saying that values.yaml is deprecated and unsupported, and Neeraj is also saying we just added Helm support, which that is the only API. You cannot not use values.yaml.
I was going to ask the same thing. So I'm trying to understand what is happening here.
John did a magic trick and embedded mesh config in values.yaml. So while values.yaml itself is not supported, mesh config inside values.yaml is supported.
No.
Interesting.
So
right, but there's still all the other stuff, right? Like the resources, the image, the ports, all this other stuff.
That's the part which is not yet ready. I mean, CPU allocations and the other stuff, but they are not so many and they're relatively easy to support. I mean, their standard, Helm behavior is not something that we do especially for Istio.
Okay. So I think you need to describe what you just described in a way that will be consumable by a user, right? Because we don't support values.yaml can't be the first part of any sentence, right? Where we say we support Helm in user doc.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and also give guidance for people who are on Helm today, because the 3 users Mitch interviewed are all using Helm, right? Values.yaml are not the first citizen
Okay.
API. What are their way to migrate?
Okay, I apologize for the confusion. I mean, I meant except mesh config and the standard Helm, we should not support arbitrary Istio feature in values.
So, irrespective of solving it right now, it looks like someone in the environments working group should communicate with other people and understand what this means and document it. Right? We don't have to fix everything like you were saying.
Yeah.
At least document it. Okay.
One thing I want to comment on, this is going way back, but we say some idea of support releases for 1 year or something along those lines. We have very different interpretations of support than our users in some cases. So for example, today we say we support 1.6. And at this point in time, when it's end of life in 2 or 3 weeks, there is a very small chance that we will be backporting bug fixes, right? If the security release came out, we would certainly support it. But we have users, specifically here, Carl, who has issues that have been fixed on master. We have tons of bugs that we say, this is fixed on master, please upgrade, or this is fixed on 1.7, please upgrade. And we don't backport the fix. And so if we claim, like there's basically 2 levels of support. It's like the minimum that we can claim we support because we do the security fixes, and then what we actually support, like sometimes it's not even 1.7 at this point. Like we fix plenty of bugs on master and we don't backport them, right? We don't backport everything. And so we should take that into account if we consider something like 1 year, because that's just going to get worse and worse. I can't imagine most bug fixes being backported a year back unless there's like extreme complaints by users. Most developers is just going to be pushed to master and someone will pick it up eventually.
What I'd add is, in the context of security releases, where we do go, all the way back, the people who are responsible for the backport, especially for things like backporting to Envoy releases that are a year old, they complain a lot. It is very hard for them because the code has changed so much over the span of a year. So we have to really think through this decision before we make it. It can be very high cost to go that far back in time.
Yeah, some of it's not even possible, really. Like we fix bugs that they just have so many dependencies on changes. Some of them even, deep architectural things that it's not possible to even backport it to 1.7. So.
Yeah, so I think there's a question there about whether is the rate of infrastructural and architectural and feature velocity in the project changing in aggregate? And so can we rely on our stabilization of our roadmap to address some of these concerns?
And also Envoy's roadmap.
Yeah.
I think where we are is the community. Our users expect that stabilization, whether we believe it or not, right, Louis? So we have to figure out that way or communicate that don't use this in production. We can't have it in both ways.
Or make it easier to upgrade.
So we are very clearly trying to reduce the supported surface, right? Whether it's codifying a shared schema between values.yaml and mesh config for operator and Helm, right? Or reducing the number of environment variables we allow you to inject, right? And then there's a question, right, where customers have used those things, and then we now where we never made a statement of support before, but now we're going to have to maybe provide tooling to help them assess that they're using an unsupported thing, because the number of touch points with the system that people can customize right now is so high. Right? What are all of the APIs today? Right? It's huge. Not just accounting for CRDs, right? The entire API surface. Yeah.
Yeah, while so Costin's point about environment variables, while that's true, then we shouldn't recommend to users when they open bugs that use environment variables as a workaround, right? That's
well, as a workaround, it is reasonable to recommend it. I mean, I'm saying not as an API. It's in this release, if something is broke, you can use this environment to turn it off or to alter the behavior. Just like you would use an envoy filter. I mean, it's specific to a revision, it's specific to a specific thing that you are doing, but it's not an API that you can rely cross versions that will work.
But do they know that? Do they know the limitations?
That's what I'm trying to say.
We need to, yeah, I know. We need to document, do we even document the environment variables publicly? I don't think.
Yes, we did. Actually, I just submitted a PR saying
Yeah.
all the environment are experimental.
Yeah, I raised this in the documentation working group to not generate documentation from command line flags for pilot, Istio and so forth, and environment variables, because neither are intended as an API.
In fact, I would go further saying some of the destabilization has been because people add features gated by environment variables, and because it's experimental, there are no integration tests or any sort of testing bar it meets. And then it just becomes a maintenance nightmare going forward because
very interesting.
That path has never been exercised.
Yeah.
And now it will break.
But that's a bug in the testing. I mean, when the feature reach alpha, they need to have tests. I mean, it doesn't matter if they have environment variable or not. I mean, they need to have an API that controls them, and they need to be tested. That's our requirement.
When do we slow down the experiments?
Hopefully
Louis,
never.
Maybe we should. Louis, when does Istio become boring?
I don't know when. I hope it becomes incrementally more boring. So I think there's a problem here, right? And we're probably going to have to take a stance on it. If there are undocumented APIs, or APIs for which there is no tooling to inform the user about the risk of using it when they perform an upgrade, can we support it?
I think it's inherently unsupportable.
To clarify a bit, I mean, in Google, when a new feature is developed, starts as an experiment that is, rolled to few users, to dog fooders, to internal users, and so forth. And after long process, it goes into the production and the APIs. But it always starts as an experiment that is restricted to the most internal user dog fooders and kind of risk aware people. So that's why I'm saying we should always have experiments first.
In the Google analogy, it's also very easy to end experiments and yank them out. It's harder here.
If we don't document them and we follow this path, I mean, that was the intent of the environment.
SaaS offerings are fundamentally different than customer managed infrastructure products.
Right. So as an example, right, if you told a customer to use an experiment, how would anybody, right, how do we keep track of that? Right. The one example that you gave, Costin, right, for managed services, the way they keep track of it is the developers know which customers have which experiments.
Exactly.
We need a similar mechanism.
So it's very simple. We don't tell them. I mean, like employee filters, there are things that are not meant to be used in any production systems. They're experiments.
Sure, like undocumented stuff that we never expose to users, that's fine, right?
Yep.
Stuff that we want users to experiment to help us qualify, that we can't keep track of.
I think this is exactly, you're hitting it on the head here, right, Louis? A transition from a SaaS offering to a self-managed system, you don't have those tools, and you don't have the notification mechanism to tell them, hey, we are going to break you, but we have already done the migration for you, so we actually won't break you. Like it's Google.
So the good news The good news is that with Central Istio, we are kind of going to operate in a SaaS mode, and
Well,
that can take care of testing the experiments.
That's vendors help their users. There's still a huge community of unvendored users, right?
No, but I mean that the experiment testing and maturization can be handled in the central or kind of in this.
No.
Yeah, but Costin, that still only helps like vendors who are selling those solutions, right? It doesn't help the other part of the community.
Hey guys, I realize that we're 5 minutes over. I got to drop, but please carry on. See you.
I think it would be useful if we could codify the way that we enable experiments that we want users, right? And be very strict about how it's codified and make any tooling aware of it. That might help remediate the situation. Right, but then that requires that codification to exist as part of a supported schema. Right, it is an API. It's an API to use, right, things that are not supported. And we can make that API simple, right? It can be a map, right? But it has to exist in a place that the tool can get access to it, so that it could actually be there. And nothing else to say, look, this is the one place you go to see if you're using unsupported stuff.
I agree. It's consistent with employee filter. What we're saying about employee filters.
Yes, yeah, but like we don't codify that right now.
Agreed. We should.
Someone please upload the recording. I need to drop. Thanks.
Yeah, and just before we all disappear here, so are we agreed that we need a follow-up small group to go through this from a TOC point of view?
Yeah, Josh said he would schedule.
Yeah,
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we had that covered. This is definitely not ended yet.
Yeah.
I'm going to
Thanks,
stick it on
folks.
for next week too. All right.
Thank you.